Hi, everyone. Welcome and thank you for attending our panel discussion. My name is Michelle D'Amico, and I'm the Director for Non-Credit and Public Programs at the Center for Global Affairs within the NYU School of Professional Studies. We're delighted to offer tonight's program with our partners who you will hear from momentarily. Before I turn this over to them, I'd like to let you know that this webinar is being recorded and the video will be posted online at a later date. We will notify all attendees once it becomes available. All participants' screens and microphones have been muted. We encourage you to submit your questions to the panelists through the Q&A tool, which you should be able to find at the bottom of your screen. And now, without further ado, I'd like to turn this over to Paulo Carrozza, Director of the Kellogg Institute for International Studies at Notre Dame.
Good evening and welcome. Welcome to this evening's panel discussion on the US presidential election and Asia policy. I'm Paulo Carrozza. I'm the director of the Kellogg Institute for International Studies at the University of Notre Dame's Keough School of Global Affairs. As an international institute focusing on the study of democracy and development and a mission to explore the relationship of scholarship to policy, the Kellogg Institute is very pleased to partner tonight with NYU and with our Notre Dame alumni in New York City to bring you this distinctive panel discussion. This evening's event wouldn't have been possible without the collaboration of the Center for Global Affairs at New York University and the Notre Dame Club of New York City, as well as the co-sponsorship of the Keough School of Global Affairs and the Liu Institute for Asia and Asian Studies. A special note of thanks is due to Marco Zuccarello, president of the Notre Dame Club of New York, Joshua Eisenman, and the invaluable crew working behind the scenes, Michelle D'Amico, Casey Forrest, Teresa Hanlon, and Karen Clay. Now it's my pleasure to introduce to you this evening's moderator. Sean King is an expert on East Asia and serves as Senior Vice President for Park Strategies. Sean has served in a number of advisory roles in government and private industry, including as Senior Advisor for Asia at the US Department of Commerce, and in Singapore for both PricewaterhouseCoopers and Citibank. Sean is an alumnus of the University of Notre Dame and has continued to share his insights with his alma mater as an affiliated scholar with the Liu Institute. Please welcome Mr. Sean King.
Paulo, thanks very much, and thanks everyone for being here tonight. Before we get started, I just want to notice the absence of one of our panelists. Professor Rebecca Carl, Professor of History at NYU, was supposed to be with us tonight, but she's not feeling well and couldn't make it, and it's a great loss. But the rest of us are going to try our best to make up for where we can. So in alphabetical order, which is in the order I'll start the discussion, I'm going to introduce the three remaining panelists. Kevin Chen is Chief Economist at Horizon Financial. He's also an adjunct associate professor at NYU, where he teaches fintech and political risk. And he invests in the mainland Chinese and US healthcare sectors. Joshua Eisenman is an associate professor of global affairs at the Keough School at Notre Dame and a senior fellow for China Studies at the American Foreign Policy Council. His research focuses on the political economy of China's development and its foreign relations with the United States and the developing world, particularly Africa. Now, Joshua is the only one of us not seated in New York tonight, but he's from the area and is also a rabid New York Mets fan, so I'll give him that. There you go. Ankit Panda is an award-winning writer, analyst, and researcher. He's editor-at-large of The Diplomat, whose podcast I regularly enjoy. And he's also director of research at The Diplomat's Risk Intelligence, The Diplomat's consulting and analysis arm, and also the author of this new book that I just happen to have, Kim Jong-un and the Bomb. So without further ado, let's get into it and start talking the issues at hand today. Kevin, I notice you teach political risk, and if I were doing business in or with mainland China, I'd see both pluses and minuses for each candidate. How would you, in your role, gauge the political risk from a point of view of doing business in or with mainland China, depending on whether Trump or Biden wins the election?
Sure. First, I want to thank you, Sean, and everyone for the invitation to speak here. Yes, I do teach at NYU the political risk class for the last 8 years, And I have to say that things have changed so much. I would say until a couple of years ago, the political risk about the situation to invest in China is pretty low. However, for the past several years, things really heated up, and you can, it could be, we can talk about it for several hours about the reason, but clearly the risk level has went up, and I would say for not only for the direct investors into into China or in portfolio investors, but even for investors who are based in the US and invest in the Chinese companies who are public traded on New York Stock Exchange and the NASDAQ, you see a lot of back and forth, but also a lot of real issues, even about the recent headlines that we can observe about the social media firms from China who are very active in the US, about the short video apps, and about a lot of other issues. So I think going forward, clearly, we do not see calm down. In fact, it looks like either party in the U.S., whether a Democratic Party, whether they are going to be winning, have a blue sweep, or the current administration, both look like to be a very to still take a very hard line going forward toward China. And I think investors need to be aware of it and need to run a lot of risk mitigation strategy going forward.
Yeah. Kevin, one follow-up I have for you on that. In years past, whenever there were trade conflicts between the US and China, China could often rely on the US business community as a force multiplier to sort of make the Chinese case to US legislators. But we don't see American business defending trade and investment with China as it did before. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that is a very good point. In fact, I would say the trend probably changed 2-3 years ago. I remember the U.S.-China Chamber of Commerce. They used to, I would say, be promoting a lot of dialogue, etc. But I think about 2 years ago, when we met the Chamber of Commerce, they became much more pessimistic. They became much more worried about what's going to happen going forward. And I think a lot of catalysts triggered the change. And I think the trend is not very good. Yeah.
Josh, in 2017, when President Trump came into office, he threw just about everybody in the region in turmoil by doing things that hadn't been done before. Most notably, immediately upon coming into office, he left the Trans-Pacific Partnership and threatened to tear up the US-South Korea Free Trade Agreement and also NAFTA, lighting a fire under South Korea and Canada. Somewhat surprisingly and not often talked about, Matt Pottinger, who's now Deputy National Security Advisor, he kind of in a low profile way attended the 2017 meeting in Shanghai of the One Belt, One Road project, which today is called the Belt and Road Initiative. And I know BRI is a big issue in terms of US-China competition for world influence. So no matter who wins in November, can the US compete with China on BRI? Should we compete with China on BRI? And as someone who follows China in the developing world, in particular Africa, just what's your thoughts on BRI in general?
Well, thanks so much, Sean, for that excellent question. And I just have to take a moment to thank Paolo and Marco for their support, but especially I want to thank Michelle. And if I could just take us back 10 years ago when I was a graduate student at UCLA, Michelle took a flyer on me and allowed me to teach a course at NYU. It really changed my entire future. And I ended up teaching at NYU Shanghai, where I ended up doing my field work, and the rest is history. So I won't go into detail. But this is really a coming full circle to have these two great institutions, NYU and Notre Dame, coming together here. So hopefully it's the beginning of a beautiful relationship. In terms of your question, there's been a lot of discussion about what BRI is, but I would say fundamentally, it's an effort for China to shape the strategic environment. to shape its own strategic environment, to do its best to place itself at the center of Asia, at the center, a node of this kind of network that it's building. In many ways, the U.S. doesn't have to do that. We created an alliance structure, which we built over a period of time with our alliance partners. Moreover, we're more supportive of free markets. The U.S. has always been supportive of free markets. And so I don't think we have to create a BRI. And let me take a step further. I don't know that the American taxpayer would let us take a do a BRI, and I don't think that the private sector would either. And I know that Kevin, you may have view on this, but my sense is if Citibank said and made an announcement that they were going to take multiple billions of dollars and invest it into the least creditworthy nations of the world in a completely untransparent manner, I think their stock price would fall. I don't think their shareholders would like it, and so I'm not sure the U.S. system is kind of set up for that kind of an intervention. And moreover, I would say that a lot of the things that BRI started doing, those big infrastructure projects, rail and bridges, roads and airports, those kinds of things in a post-COVID world may become less important anyway. And so we already see a discussion about how China is moving BRI to a digital Silk Road, to a health Silk Road, trying to alter BRI to deal with the new environment that it finds itself in. But the fact is that under previous conditions, billions and billions of dollars in loans were made. And I am not one of the people who talks of the debt trap, because everything that I have done in my research tells me that China always wants to get paid back. It doesn't want to trap them in some debt and not get paid back. It wants to get paid back. And now it's trying to figure out, I think, under this uncertain climate where it's getting pressure from the G20, where it's getting pressure from the smaller countries that it lent this money to, how to navigate this environment, which is very unpredictable. And, we hadn't predicted we'd be here. So when we talk about political risk, I think China is facing major political risk with regard to BRI. And now the question is, how are they going to take that forward in a sustainable way? Another big question with regard to BRI is the scale of it. In many ways, BRI started as one thing, and now it has become all aspects of Chinese foreign policy. And now we get into a kind of a philosophical question. If BRI is everything, is it nothing? I guess we'll leave that for the philosophers. But the most important thing is to note that BRI is now a part of almost every aspect of Chinese foreign policy. And that is a kind of evolution in the scale of the program.
Okay, great. Thank you. Ankit, probably nowhere has President Trump broken precedent as much as in relations with North Korea. So it's October 2020. After two leaders' summits, apparently impromptu handshake at the DMZ, where are we on North Korea as opposed to 4 years ago? Also, as a listener to your podcast, I know you track North Korea weapons systems like Keith Richards talks about guitars. So when you reflect on where we are, please also keep in mind and maybe share with our listeners your observations from the parade in Pyongyang 2 weekends ago. Take it away.
Sure. So Sean, thanks for the great question. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me today. This is actually potentially one of my last foreign policy hurrahs in New York City, since I am slated to move to Washington in the not too distant future.
You're off to the swamp.
Exactly. Hopefully, we'll see. Political conditions might be quite different by the time I arrive. But addressing the North Korea issue. So we did have a very unprecedented sort of diplomacy with the North Koreans. We have been talking to them for about 30 years about their nuclear program. There have been previous attempts, but the thing that the Trump administration tried that had never been done before was to just talk to the leader. And it makes sense with the North Korean political system intuitively. It's a monolithic authoritarian system. Kim Jong-un calls the shots. It is effectively a Marxist-Leninist monarchy, the only one on earth. So what do we get for the effort that we put in? And the case that I was making back in 2018, even before the Singapore summit, and certainly after the Singapore summit took place that June, was that the process seemed rather shallow to me. That it had one important effect, which was that it let out the steam that had been building over 2017, which was a dangerous year. Certainly the second half of 2017 was really, I think, took us close to an actual military exchange with North Korea. And we avoided that in 2018 by letting some of that steam out, allowing for diplomacy to take its course. Of course, my interpretation of events that year is very much it was again at Kim Jong Un's behest that we entered the diplomatic process. Kim determined that in 2017 he had demonstrated the sort of capabilities that he needed to generate sufficient leverage to come to the negotiating table. But he may have miscalculated, of course, because things fell apart a year later in Hanoi, Vietnam, at the second U.S. North Korea leader summit, when the two sides just couldn't come to an agreement over sanctions relief for denuclearization. So fast forward to today, we've just seen a North Korean military parade 11 days ago. The North Koreans have shown us what they've been up to in the 2+ years that diplomacy has been allowed to run its course, and they've been hard at work. They have no strategic intention to give up their nuclear capabilities, meaning that they have not only quantitatively expanded their nuclear forces, but they have continued to qualitatively refine their capabilities. So this means they've iterated on the technologies that they had available in 2017 and earlier. They have better missiles, larger missiles, more capable missiles today. And that means that whoever's president next year, North Korea is going to be on the foreign policy agenda. Now, will it be at the top of the agenda? I think that's an open question. The North Koreans thrust themselves onto the top of the agenda when President Trump came into office in early 2017, because that was the year that we just happened to see major qualitative breakthroughs. That was the first time, for instance, that North Korea in July, on July 4th, tested an intercontinental range ballistic missile. So if we see a continued Trump administration or we see a Biden administration, I would expect the North Koreans to make their presence known. They certainly want us to devote our energies to doing diplomacy with them in the future. I think they're still hopeful that we might decide that the reality of their program being what it is, the only way forward will be to come to the negotiating table and acquiesce to their demands. But whatever happens going ahead, the North Korea problem is not going away. It's not about to solve itself. But we just have to figure out how to talk to the North Koreans, who are more capable than they've ever been in terms of their nuclear capabilities, and they're not about to give them up. So the question now is how do we make something of this bad situation that we find ourselves in today in Northeast Asia?
Yeah, Marxist-Leninist monarchy is exactly true, but I'd also add it's an ultranationalist at that. If Biden were to win, would you expect there to be more provocations sooner and larger than if Trump wins? Because I think Kim has a lot invested in Trump. I think he's willing to give Trump some time to see what he can give him. But if Biden wins, I would expect more severe provocations right away. What's your take?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so, Kim's met Trump 3 times, Singapore, Hanoi, and the DMZ handshake. And I think what he's figured out is that Trump certainly isn't like a conventional American president. We don't really have much of an interagency process to speak of when it comes to North Korea policy, which means talking to the president is valuable in the same way that Trump might have calculated that talking to Kim Jong-un is valuable. But of course, what he learned over the course of the Singapore, Hanoi, and DMZ summits is that Trump is very much like shaking a magic 8 ball. You shake the magic 8 ball and you can get a different result every time. The result that Kim found in Singapore, I think, pleased him. The result he found in Hanoi did not please him because he did not get the sanctions relief he was looking for. So in general, I do agree that I think the North Koreans are, if they have a preference in this election, I think it would be for President Trump to be reelected. So they have another shot at shaking the magic 8 ball, potentially hoping for a better result than they've gotten in the past. With Biden, it's a little bit more of an open question. I think what we actually saw in the Democratic primaries when we saw candidates debate North Korea policy when it did come up was that there is a debate now on the Democratic side of the aisle about the proper course forward with North Korea. So on one hand, you have folks who are very content to basically make the bet that time is on our side, which means that when it comes to carrots and sticks with North Korea, we're still better positioned to apply pressure and sticks, basically tell the North Koreans that we are not going to make the first move. We are going to wait for them to realize that the sanctions pressure that we have placed on their economy is not in their interest, and they should make the strategic decision to give up their nuclear weapons. On the other side, you have folks like me who make the case that we need to be realistic about where the North Koreans are with their capabilities today. And even if we still want to disarm them in the future, we go into negotiating with them in the short term, recognizing that what we're really dealing with is no longer a non-proliferation problem, but it's more a problem of nuclear risk reduction and risk management. That the North Koreans have nuclear weapons, we are in a nuclear deterrence relationship with them, and that presents risks on the Korean Peninsula that weren't there necessarily even when the Obama administration left office. So that debate, it's not clear to me how that's going to play out. If Biden does win, there will be a policy review on North Korea, and I expect many of these things will be duked out at the interagency level, certainly. But I would expect the inertia to pull in the direction of precedent, which means that I wouldn't expect a Biden presidency to necessarily invert, where we've stood on North Korea policy now for years.
Great. Kevin, fintech's a very dynamic field. And as we saw in the Supreme Court hearings last week, healthcare is a very hot button issue here in this country. Now, I kind of think Trump's phase one trade deal with China is dead. And either way, we have to be honest that it's Americans who pay the tariffs, not China. But was there any, in those sectors, fintech and healthcare, was there anything in the phase one trade deal that caught your eye? And is there anything that either candidate's talking about that excites you in those areas? Or if you could have their ear, what would you want to see in either fintech or healthcare between the US and China going forward?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question, Sean. First, I like to actually add something which is a little different from your perspective.
Mm-hmm.
I personally think the phase one trade deal between the US and China is a success. If we look at a couple of things, measures, right? One, there have been a major breakthrough of the market access for the American companies in the Chinese market. Citigroup, for the first time, got a license to operate fund management custodian license in China. JP Morgan, Bridgewater, Vanguard, etc. They all got their license to operate funds, commercial banking, etc. in China. That's the first time it has happened probably since 1949 for the American banking and financial institutions to get a fully operational license in China. That's really part of the trade deal. Second, also from the goods trading point of view, this year, China has been exporting a lot to the US, clearly part of it because of COVID, but also America has been exporting a lot of things to China. Corn, volume went up 6 times. China has been buying 6 times corn from the US, from Midwestern states versus last year. Crude oil purchase more than doubled. If you look at the trading part, it has been actually really booming. Of course, it's a little, we have not seen a lot of coverage because it's not really, people do not pay too much attention to how much China buys corn from US or crude oil. But also even for the traditional manufacturing sector, Tesla this week, in fact, started export electronic vehicles made in Shanghai to be sold in Germany or in European Union. And Tesla got the operation license in China to make cars, which is the first. Previously, no other car companies from US, from Germany, from Japan got the fully 100% on factory being up and running in China. So all those are major breakthroughs. And specifically also, I think about fintech and healthcare. I would say for fintech itself, this year, there have been some progress. For example, Visa and MasterCard both got their license to operate in China. And that's also the first, since 1949, probably, for the American, payment system to operate in China. And of course, it remains to be seen how successful they will be, but at least now they got a license. I would say what I like to see going forward is really, more, I would say, license to be opened up to the global companies, not only Visa, MasterCard, but there are a lot of payment firms globally, right, to open up the Chinese market. And on the other hand, for this current issue of the WeChat, TikTok, and all those, they all have some payment function embedded in the app. What's their legal status in the US? Currently, it's very unclear what's going to happen. And the Department of Commerce, the State Department, they all issued some, I would say, a news release about some limitation or control going forward. and there have been some lawsuits filed by these companies as well. So I like to see some, clarification. What's really, what does the current the situation will be stand going forward. Probably, I guess this is an issue to be resolved post election here. But the market is too big to ignore. And also, I think the American companies are already pushing into it. But I think we will see what's going to happen next year. Healthcare, that's another major area. We invest in many healthcare properties in the U.S., hospitals, etc., and also in Asia Pacific. The statistics are very, very, it's unbelievable to see. For example, in the U.S., for male, the prostate cancer, 5 years survival rate is almost 100%. For females, the breast cancer, 5 years survival rate is above 85% in the U.S. In China, the prostate cancer 5 years survival rate is below 40%, and for the breast cancer is around 30%. So both, you're looking at half or less than half of the survival rate for male and female, the two major cancers. And these are the areas that China needs to invest aggressively, massively for its citizens. They need resources to be put in. They need technology. They need help, and also Joshua mentioned about the BRI project. Even in China, sometimes I write those things on social media. I got a lot of heat in China about it because it's not everyone in China believes in that they should spend $1 trillion on the BRI. At the same time, about 600 million people, or about half of the population in China, makes about less than $300 per month. And they need, the citizens, they need the resource, for the healthcare, for education, etc. They want more for improve their living standard. It's already went up a lot, but still it's very low current level for healthcare, etc. And I think that's an area that it's a problem, I would say, across Asian countries. In China, in India, in the Philippines, we see all very similar statistics of the gap of the patient survival rate, etc. And these are the areas I think we can help. And that will bring a lot of goodwill for America too.
Got it. That's great. Thank you. Josh, now the president likes to boast about all the jobs he's brought back to the US from other countries and how much he's devastated the Chinese economy with his tariffs and whatnot, so-called reshoring. How real is this? Rick Newman in Yahoo wrote yesterday a great stat. He said, even with the pandemic and the decreased buying power and decrease in economic activity in the US, in absolute terms, imports from Vietnam are up 14% year on year to the United States. That tells me I'm not sure these jobs are coming back to the US from China. They're just going other places. So can you talk, how real is reshoring? Is it really just a diversification of supply chains? And if Biden were to win and Japan would let us back, do you think he'd even consider getting back into TPP, for example?
Well, that's a great question and a lot of soothsaying. So I'll do my best, but it's dangerous work. I guess maybe I could start off by just saying one thing, if Ankit wouldn't mind my poaching on his turf a little bit, and say I guess I'm a little concerned that both the Democratic and Republican Party want to believe that the path of peace in North Korea is through Beijing. And just prior to all of Trump's diplomacy, the North Korea-China relationship was the worst I'd ever seen it. There were editorials coming out criticizing China from North Korea. Then Trump starts his approach, and we see Kim flying on Chinese jets and showing up in Beijing talking to Big Brother Xi. And so I wonder whether or not these two parties are going to get it around their head what Xi Jinping explained directly, personally to Donald Trump, which is that China is not going to help in this process. And it's not China's interest to assist the U.S. on North Korea. So to me, I see both misguided with regard to that. In terms of reshoring. Or what's called reshoring. I mean, look, of course, it's politically good to talk about jobs coming back to the U.S., but you're exactly right. I mean, I think what we need to do is have a secure supply chain, and with the political risk that is now in the U.S.-China relationship, and that risk growing because what had been a trade war is now exacerbated and expanding. I think we're going to see more movement probably into Southeast Asia countries. Japan has put forward a multi-billion-dollar fund to incentivize its companies to move out of China and into other Asian countries. And so I do see an increasing effort here to kind of readjust the supply chain. And like, if you think of a river, there were old channels in Southeast Asia, the tigers, right? And those kind of could be restarted and expanded. Those old channels could be rebuilt. And I think that's to some degree what's happening, right now. And then of course, new channels in Vietnam, et cetera. But I do think ultimately what we need is a secure supply chain. So this can't be a US national endeavor because we don't have comparative advantage in every product along the supply chain. I mean, we just don't. But we can, working with a variety of other countries, put that together. But ultimately, I think we cannot divorce economics from politics and military. And if we look at the Palm Mill, we see an expansion of the Quad, the quadrilateral dialogue, which includes India, Japan, the US, and Australia, and then increasingly including other countries in that dialogue in different ways. And then we also see in the intelligence sphere, we see the Five Eyes network, which is also expanding its intelligence sharing. And so it seems to me that you're right, Sean, that we do have to go back to a kind of TPP. What that TPP looks like, what is the relationship between the US and the existing TPP structure that went forward. Remember, you see, it was interesting. When I was in Beijing, I used to hear friends in China say a lot to me, it's the US who's trying to constrain us. You're working with others and you're giving them these ideas to work against us. And I think what happened with the TPP might have surprised folks because the US pulls out and they go forward anyway. They took the ball and they moved it forward. And the US can rejoin TPP. And it seems to me that that would be a wise strategic move. Now, I don't know what the terms of that agreement would be. So I can't say it would 100% be a good idea. But if you look at the quadrilateral dialogue and you look at the Five Eyes, it seems that you need to have an economic pillar there in order to kind of buttress the existing kind of institutional infrastructure that exists in Asia at this point.
Now, I swear, Josh did not know what I'm about to ask Ankit, but this is on my list and it's the perfect segue. So Ankit, Obama had the pivot or the rebalance, and then Trump and Pompeo really has been the mouthpiece of it, incorporated this Indo-Pacific strategy, which started in Japan. Could you compare and contrast the two? And particularly, I'm interested, India, who's been very independence-minded, its relationship with the Quad and where Modi sees India fitting into this wider Indo-Pacific strategy. Ankit, can't hear Ankit.
Sorry about that. So those are great questions. It's a lot to comment on in one go, but I'll do my best to address that. So generally, the pivot or the rebalance to Asia and the Indo-Pacific strategy, I do see a lot of continuity on some level, right? Both inherently recognize, and the Trump administration said this in the National Defense Strategy, the National Security Strategy, which is that the Indo-Pacific, the Asia-Pacific, whatever you want to call it, is going to be the primary part of the world that the United States is going to be focused on economically, militarily in the future. So both administrations agree on that. The Obama administration, of course, was starting from a very different baseline. Effectively, the challenge for presidents today is, and this affected both Trump and Obama, is to recognize that even if Asia is calling your name, you need to figure out a way to rebalance your commitments to other parts of the world, most prominently the Middle East and North Africa, but even Europe and the transatlantic setting in some ways, to physically devote the kinds of resources you need in Asia to contend with intensifying competition with China, certainly, but also other issues. So that's been a huge part of it. the adoption of the Indo-Pacific language, and here, we can go back to a speech that Rex Tillerson, the former Secretary of State, delivered in, I believe it was October or November 2017. But it was a speech on U.S.-India relations, and this was really the most prominent high-level speech by a Trump administration official at the time on the concept of the Indo-Pacific. And what became apparent then was that India's role was definitely being elevated in this general um, elevation of the Indo-Pacific concept. And U.S.-India relations, we can look at our alliances and partnerships and how they fared over the Obama-Trump transition. And I think we generally find that a lot of our alliances did take a hit, certainly in Northeast Asia, and even some of our partnerships in Southeast Asia and with Australia even. But when you look at the U.S.-India relationship, you really do see that upward trajectory surviving the Obama-Trump transition and continuing upwards. Um, of course, we have seen domestic political change in India as well. Last year, we saw an Indian general election that gave Narendra Modi and the ruling Bharatiya Janata Party a larger mandate than they had received in the past, effectively giving Modi much more leeway on foreign affairs. And we've seen that manifest in a number of ways. Of course, in 2020, the most relevant being India's ongoing, now months-long border tussle with China that still continues with no signs of an early resolution. So bringing that all together and sort of tying this all back to our discussion of the Quad, which I should say, if viewers aren't aware of the Quad being the quadrilateral between the United States, Japan, Australia, and India. India has always been the odd one out. It's not a formal U.S. treaty ally where Japan and Australia are, and the trilaterals between the U.S., Japan, and Australia have generally been a lot more developed than between India and those other countries. But India has been shedding some of those historic hesitations. Just days ago, for instance, we received news that Australia would finally be included in the trilateral U.S., Japan, India Malabar naval exercise, which is going to be the first sort of, or not the first, but the resumption of Quad military exercises. The Quad, of course, having its origins back in 2006, 2007, when Prime Minister Shinzo Abe in Japan had his first prime ministerial term. Abe, of course, having now left office. So looking ahead, though, I think a lot of the signs for the Quad augur quite well. India's threat perceptions vis-a-vis China have certainly gotten larger this year in a way that I think will feed back to India potentially being open to new forms of cooperation with the U.S. and its Quad partners. We have concluded and operationalized foundational military cooperation agreements with India. We had a U.S. Navy P-8 Poseidon refuel in the Andaman Islands in September, and that was a first. So the baseline here for whoever's going to be inheriting the White House, I think, augurs well. I mean, I don't think the Quad is really a silver bullet for the problems that we face in our so-called great power competition with China. But it is going to be a promising baseline. So it has been a long time coming, but I think over time, the sheer gravity of the Indo-Pacific is beginning to pull the resources that constitute American national power towards Asia. It has taken a long time. A lot of us were very critical of the Obama administration for, of course, failing to walk the walk on the pivot or the rebalance. But really, a lot of this just takes time. And if you look at what's been happening at DoD and state, just in terms of the bureaucracy, just leaving aside the changes that the Trump administration has made, a lot of those efforts remain underway. And I'm confident that whoever's president next, a lot of our Indo-Pacific partnerships will continue to develop in a positive way.
Well, whoever wins, let's hope we can build on the gains we've made in recent years. Well, I could go on all night, but the questions are coming in. So I'm going to start picking some of them off and directing them to the person I think may be best suited to ask. Kevin, question for you. What do you think about, does it make sense to China to diversify its foreign exchange reserves away from the US dollar? And what kind of impact would that have?
Sure, that's Sean. That's a very very tough question, and
that's why I asked it.
Sure, yeah. So first, talk about Chinese foreign currency reserve. That's not very transparent. We actually do not know exactly how much are there. There have been some report about 3 trillion, 4 trillion. It used to be 4 trillion, but after there was a major stock market bubble and burst in China in 2015, 2016, and some capital flight, which caused around mysteriously about in less than 6 months, the foreign exchange reserve dropped from 4 trillion to 3 trillion. And since then, the number hasn't changed much. However, I would say the holding seems to have changed quite a bit. There have been a lot of discussion about a lot of those holdings, foreign exchange holdings, in fact, have been used for, let's say, BRI loans for a lot of those illiquid investments. So in reality, how much are there? It's subject to a lot of speculation. First, so what to diversify, right? Second, right now I think the according to the Central Bank of China, People's Bank number, most of the foreign exchange reserve are in the U.S. dollar. So what could be the alternative, right? Gold, yes, they have been buying gold, but gold is not really liquid enough to hold several hundred billion or so investment. And what are the other choices? Euro, Japanese yen, or maybe a British pound, a Swiss franc. All those, they have pros and cons, but I would say none of them is a good substitute for dollar. So for now, I think I personally do not see any, any choice, in fact, to switch, let's say, from dollar to any other currency. Maybe going forward, I think maybe in 10, 20, 30 years, there could be something different. People, in fact, now are very excited about digital currency, right? About central bank digital currency, CBDC. The one China is planning to launch one. Obviously, US is going to launch one. European Union, European Central Bank talked about one. And also we have those private issued currencies like Facebook, Libra, etc. You got a lot of currencies coming to the market. So what's going to happen? I think it's subject to a lot of discussion. But I would say for the near term, for the next 3, 5, 10 years, I doubt there could be major shift. Just there's no the condition is not ready for the move.
Josh, I think we both agree that Trump's done Beijing some favors in the region by suspending or scaling back U.S. South Korea military exercises, leaving TPP, picking fights with our allies. But when it comes to Taiwan, he's been the strongest president on that issue in recent memory. Arms sales, red carpet visit for Taiwan President Tsai Ing-wen, sending an undersecretary of state and cabinet member, leaning on other countries not to recognize Beijing. We got a question in here. What does it mean for Taiwan if Biden wins next month?
Ooh, that's about as tough as they come. Let me before I hit on the most sensitive issue there can be, let me just, if I could just mention something that Kevin talked about and build on it very quickly and link it up to BRI, because as Kevin talked about, the Chinese government had accumulated all of this U.S. currency, and part of the reasoning for BRI is to get better returns to capital, because the returns to T-bills were not high. And so you could go out in these developing countries with a low capital labor ratio, put more capital and get higher returns. But as we know, more returns often means more risk. And I think that's where we find ourselves today. So it's not only that they can't go into more currency, right? That's one way to put it, but what investments are out there for your $3 trillion plus that are going to yield returns that are better and more safe, or equally safe, or at least on the level or near it of the T-bill. And I think that's fundamentally a challenge that China has to deal with. But it's a challenge you only have to deal with when you've got that much money. So in many ways, it's an externality that we all wish we could have. In terms of the tough question, which I'm not avoiding, I think that a lot of what has happened in the region, and we see this in the Pew research that has come out about feelings towards China, a lot of the tension with India that was mentioned, a lot of the tension with Taiwan, the repercussions from what was going on in Hong Kong with the imposition of the national security law, a lot of these things have led to a kind of a general concern in the Western world, reflected in the Pew data, about China's intentions. And clearly that kind of thing is going to serve Taiwan's interest, because Taiwan has long been saying that China's a threat and China's a problem, and others hadn't taken it as seriously. And so as we see countries around the world recognizing or believing that China's a greater threat, Taiwan is able to gain more support. And we saw not only the United States, but I think the Netherlands and other countries have been engaging Taiwan in ways that they hadn't been before.
Sweden.
I'm sorry?
Sweden, for example.
Yeah, Sweden, exactly. And so when we see this, and it going now beyond the United States in terms of this kind of political engagement, this goes to the piece you and I wrote, Sean King.
Nice plug.
Yeah, well, you got to do what you can in foreign policy. I want to get that right, about how China's stated aims in Taiwan, vis-a-vis Taiwan, and its policy outcomes are not necessarily well coordinated. And so I do not believe that a Biden administration means the end of U.S. support for Taiwan, or that we'll see that's considerably reduced, because the Taiwan issue is basically the only issue that has bipartisan support in Washington. I mean, you look at the votes on Taiwan, they're almost nobody. I mean, it's like one or two people who are outstanding, but basically it's the only issue where you have strong bipartisan support. So I don't see that going away, but I do see this, and let me put this out there, and I'm curious if others have any. There are kind of, maybe two groups is too neat, but there are folks who are deeply concerned about China and its system and what that means within the Biden camp. And then there are others who had personally been involved in allowing the head of the United Front Department into the front door, not the United Front, but the head of the Chinese People's Consultative Congress into the front door of the White House, and then having, the Dalai Lama come in through the basement, right? And those people still out there. Those people are still part of the discussion. And the question, and this, and I don't know the answer, is who is going to be in what job? Who's going to have what role? Because Donald Trump is an expert at turning over tables. Hell, we're New Yorkers. We know this, right? But he's never really been good at putting tables back together, right? Or resetting them. And the question now is, if we had a Biden administration, who would reset the table? And would they try to reset it the way it was? Or would they try to make some changes to make it more reciprocal and more balanced and more sustainable? And if we tried to go back to what it was, I think we would end up where we were, which is feeding the fire of a populist who would then stoke the American people's anger about being raped by China and all this other stuff, which is why, well before Donald Trump, we had election after election where people would play the China card during the election, speak very tough on China, but then they would come in and they would adopt a more kind policy or a more engagement type of policy. The reason that happened was because the American people and the American elites became divided on China policy, such that the American people no longer believed in either set of elites' strategy vis-a-vis China. Now we are in a position where we have a strategic and a historic opportunity to reset the table, to make the gains Kevin was talking about on the economic sphere, and to do it in a way that makes this relationship more sustainable. And if a Biden administration blows that opportunity, if they try to go back to the Kissingerian way, we will have regret for generations. We need to fix this problem, and this is a once-in-a-generation opportunity to fix it and get it right. And so if the Biden administration comes on board, I hope we don't go back to the same people we had, who were those first-term Obama administration folks, who I believe have a responsibility and that they have not owned up to the consequences of the policies they pursued.
Okay. Yeah, I mentioned Sweden, not only because I was a high school exchange student there, but it's not your usual right-wing suspect. And anytime you see that Sweden, as of 2 weeks ago, has an 85% negative view of China, you know something's going on. Another interesting dynamic on Taiwan that you and I wrote about, shameless plug number 2, which could be very interesting for Biden, is now you see Beijing also going after the opposition Kuomintang and the KMT, for whatever political reasons, passing unanimously a resolution in the legislative Yuan 2 weeks ago calling for the restoration of diplomatic relations between Washington and Taipei. So the KMT itself is changing, which opens up new opportunities for Biden. So we'll see where that goes. Ankit, my sense is that I think we all accept that Kim Jong-un is probably hoping Trump wins re-election. And my own sense is also that Yoshihide Suga in Japan would probably feel more comfortable with Biden because Trump has ignored Japan's concerns over North Korea's medium and short-range missile tests, and maybe Biden won't harass Suga on trade and defense spending the way he did Moon in Korea, and maybe he'll rejoin TPP. What's your take on how either candidate's victory would affect Japan in 2021 and beyond?
Yeah, absolutely. We haven't really talked about Japan yet, but obviously our most important alliance in Asia in many ways. So Japan has obviously gone through a very important transition right now, and Suga is trying to indicate continuity with his predecessor Shinzo Abe, Japan's longest-serving post-war prime minister, on many fronts: foreign policy, economic policy, you name it. If Biden were to win, I think the Japanese would welcome a return to predictability in the alliance, and I think they, like many of our other allies, would also welcome a almost assured departure of the extortionary demands that we've made of certain allies, treating our alliances as bonds built on shared interests and democratic solidarity rather than a more mercenarial relationship that the Trump administration has tried to communicate. That said, however, I think there would still be conversations within the alliance that we would need to have with our partners in Japan, specifically when it comes to military planning for future contingencies, and not just with North Korea, but we just talked about Taiwan, Taiwan Strait contingency. There has been growing thinking in Japan for how Tokyo's evolving defense posture might play a role in any, or at least contribute to deterrence across the Taiwan Strait. And those conversations would continue under Biden. Just to briefly return to the Taiwan issue, it actually just so happens that Taipei was the last place I managed to visit before I returned to New York City for the pandemic lockdown. I believe I flew back on right before the order was issued here. Insofar as any of my impressions from Asia are still fresh, it would be the ones from Taiwan. But there is also broader concern in Taiwan, around the region, for how the United States can bring its allies and partners to contribute to sustaining deterrence in the Taiwan Strait, not just Japanese, but Quad partners, Australia, South Korea. Do they have a role to play? And many of these questions, I think, are going to grow more urgent because, as we all know, the issues, the future of the Taiwan Strait really is the future of the Asia Pacific in many ways. The regional status quo will be decided in any future contingency involving Taiwan. The risks of an actual Chinese invasion of Taiwan, I don't think they're imminent, but they are growing year on year. The CCP makes no secret of its intentions. We have seen increased saber rattling on these issues. So for Japan, I think these do loom large as major issues. On TPP and trade, look, I mean, I don't think that the United States really has any major political party that's in favor of signing up to multilateral trade regimes right now. And that's a bit of a shame because I think we've already hinted at this in our discussion tonight, but the demand for trade integration is clearly large in Asia. It's there. Vietnam, Japan, Australia, all of our many of our partners and allies in the region have moved on without us. So I don't expect that we're going to be re-entering TPP anytime soon unless something dramatically changes in American domestic politics. And there's, never say never. We are in a once in 100-year pandemic, and the economic recovery might take place through a variety of means. Perhaps entering trade regimes in Asia will play a role there, but the politics just don't appear to be in our favor, at least for those of us who would like to see the United States return to TPP. So that, unfortunately, I think will remain an obstacle for greater integration between the U.S. and Japan in Asia. But certainly, I think the Japanese would welcome a Biden victory, especially because we are about to cost negotiations, which the South Koreans were unfortunate enough to enter with us in 2018 began, but the Japanese now are going through that process with us. So if Biden does win, that has significant implications for practical host nation support talks with the Japanese.
Yeah. Well, we're nearing the end here, but I just want to try and get a few more questions. Kevin, the U.S. closed down the Chinese consulate in Houston, and China closed down ours in Chengdu. You mentioned the crackdown on different apps, and also academia has gotten caught in the crossfire. As someone who got his undergraduate degree at Renmin University in China and now teaches at NYU, what's your view on the state of academic exchange and interaction between the two countries?
Sure. Yeah, I have to also add that I got actually a large part of my education actually in Europe, in the Netherlands and Switzerland.
Yeah.
So yeah. So I would say for this for our seminar, it's very very timely because NYU has a campus in Shanghai, and NYU Shanghai is probably one of the only places in China that you can surf internet freely You can surf Google. You can watch YouTube and all those. It's one of those oases basically in China, in mainland China. So I'm a optimistic person, and I think going forward, there will be a lot of challenges between U.S. and China, but I think education should be a more positive force going forward. For now, yes, I saw some dramatic drop of the students' visa issued in China by the U.S. Consulate embassies to the U.S. I saw one statistic, which is same time last year. Of course, August is a season, right, for students to come to the U.S. American consulate or embassies in China issued in total about 7,000 student visas. This year for August, 3. So a job of, a job of magnitude impossible to imagine last year. You can call it's because of virus of whatever reason, but it is a huge job, and I think it's an unfortunate development because students are the future. I personally think if we can educate more middle class kids from China in the American education system, or more graduate students, it will be actually like planting seeds for future. We might not immediately see any benefit, but I think it's going to be a good development going forward. And now what I'm seeing is a lot of the I would say wealthier families in China. They're trying to send their kids to study in UK, in Australia. Maybe Australia is not on very good term with China either. They're trying to send kids to Singapore, to Germany, etc. And that's an area I think maybe it has been too much a change. Maybe a total shutdown of from 7,000 to 3 is too far. Yes.
Josh, very quickly, my favorite band Oasis had their 2009 concerts in Shanghai and Beijing canceled because someone found video of older brother Noel Gallagher playing in a free Tibet concert in 1997. In this week, K-pop band BTS is in trouble because at the Korea Society Gala 2 weeks ago, they praised the U.S.-South Korean war effort during the Korean War, and now they're losing a lot of mainland Chinese endorsements and contracts. I knew you've thought about this. Where is Chinese soft power today, and where is it going?
Well, thanks. Again, I want to associate myself with what Kevin just said a moment ago. I'm an alumnus of the Hopkins Nanjing Center, and I used to teach at NYU Shanghai. And these are essential programs. I know it's really hard, but I completely support this students, and I really think that we need to continue them. I work with Chinese professors, and I think it's important, especially liberal arts training. I mean, we can talk all we want about, the hard sciences and all this stuff, but for what I teach, more Chinese students, great, welcome. And I hope that message gets out there that we at the Keough School of Global Affairs at Notre Dame want students from all around the world. We are a global affairs school, and we want them from China, from Taiwan, from all over Asia. So that's my bumper sticker. In terms of soft power, I think China's facing a hit, and it's partly due to COVID, but it's also partly due to the debt obligations that famously, I think. Former central banker who said that we don't know who's swimming naked until the tide goes back, and the tide is as back as it can get. I mean, and so we see a lot of questions about loans, and we see criticisms coming from Nigeria and from Zambia and from Ethiopia in ways that we just hadn't heard before. And so, there's a question of how to explain soft power under those circumstances. But let me beg the question. I don't think soft power is the right term. I think when we talk about what China's doing, the best term we can use is a Chinese term, and that's foreign-focused propaganda work. And that is what's going on here, because these programs are generally government-driven and government-run. So when the Chinese government is hosting, say, journalists from countries for training programs, those are programs that are funded by the Chinese taxpayer. And so it's important to differentiate that from K-pop, and differentiate that from Manchester United Soccer and differentiate that from the New York Yankees and things which are not government. So I think when we talk about soft power, sometimes over this important difference. But a lot of the kind of engagement that China does in the developing world is government driven engagement. And so I think that we need to kind of reassess how we look at that. But if we're talking about the kind of attractiveness of the Chinese system, and remember, Xi Jinping made a very clear statement. He wanted folks to tell a good Chinese story. That was his instructions to his comrades. And so the question is, how are they doing on that? And the answer is probably not so good in the West. But the numbers are still holding in Africa. I think that but there are questions. There are major issues. For example, there was in Guangzhou a few months ago, there was an incident where some Africans were put out onto the street because of COVID. Now that was not something that probably would have raised a wrinkle, except for the fact that it got tweeted, it got put out there, and before you knew it, the Chinese government was playing catch up, trying to deal with this as a public relations issue. And so, I think that to the extent that the splinter net between the Chinese internet and the outside world causes the Chinese leaders to be slow on the uptake in terms of realizing how they're perceived, then it becomes a foreign policy problem for them. And so it's really important to not only be able to push out using your fingers, but also to be receptive and understand how people are taking in and how people are perceiving of you and your policies. And I think with BRI, that's particularly important.
Josh, thank you very much, but I'm going to pretend you did not say Manchester United and that you instead said Manchester City. So with that, Ankit, I had a great question for you on how real the new U.S. policy is on the South China Sea announced in July, but we're out of time. But I know Ankit addressed this on one of his podcasts, so I encourage you to go to The Diplomat. You get 5 free articles a month, but you should be subscribing anyway. But go listen to that podcast. It was this summer. Very valuable. I want to thank everybody for being here tonight. I want to thank our panelists for a great discussion. This could go on a lot longer, but sadly we're at an end. And with that, I'd like to turn it back to Michelle.
Thank you, Sean, and thank you so much to all of our amazing panelists tonight. It was a really riveting and insightful conversation, so thank you guys for spending this evening with us. I'd also like to thank our partners again, the Kellogg Institute for International Studies at the University of Notre Dame, the Notre Dame Club of New York City, the Kellogg School for Global Affairs, and the Liu Institute for Asia and Asian Studies. Also, my counterparts at Notre Dame, Don Stiletto, Karen Clay, and Teresa Hanlon. And thank you to everybody who was able to log in tonight. As you saw in the chat, we did record tonight's event and it will be posted online shortly. We'll be sure to send out a message to all of you. So thank you again, and we look forward to hopefully hosting another conversation such as this in the future. Everyone have an excellent evening. Thanks again.